Okay, can you raise your thumbs in case you can hear a voice now in the Zoom audience? Okay, I see a thumb there. Good. Oh, hi, Claudia. Good to see you. Odette, good to see you. Good to see everyone. Good to see all those people for the first language circle of 2024. It's great to have this, how do you say, an audience that sticks to us, kind of. Before I start introducing today's speaker, I need to make a couple of announcements. The first one is that the Zoom audience can unfortunately not just speak up. You are all muted, and that's a safety precaution measure, really, because last year we had an occasion of Zoom trolling, and we don't want that to happen again. So please, in case you have a question, make yourself seen with an emoticon, type something in the chat, and then we are happy to call you up and give you the microphone. Okay. The second thing that I need to announce is that this talk and all talks actually of the language circle meeting series, they're being recorded. And we want to put everything, or we already did start to put everything from last year's circle on YouTube, which I think is a great thing. But if you disagree on being seen on screen here in the room, or if you disagree on being heard in the audience when you ask a nasty question in the discussion, then please find a way to not show your video, or here in the room, move outside the scope of the camera. The third thing that I need to announce is dinner. Exactly. We are meeting for dinner tonight after the presentation at Vegan House at
6:30.
6:30. Thank you, Caro. Yeah. So if you are in the area of Leipzig, then find your way to the Vegan House. I think it's on Riemannstraße in Südvorstadt. And I had to say a fourth thing, right? There was four things. 1, 2, 3, 4. No. Anyway, it will come back later. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for coming, Tineke Snijders, all the way from Tilburg University, where Tineke works as an assistant professor. Tineke received a PhD from the Donner Center, working on sentence comprehension like many at the Donner Center. Afterwards, she did a postdoc at Utrecht, studying visual processing and autism, and then receiving her own Veni grant on rhythmic processing, and rhythmic sensitivity in language acquisition, not only speech rhythm, but also multimodal rhythms. And I think that's also what you will be talking about today. And obviously, given the kind of topic of this research group here and of the language circle as a whole, we are looking very much forward to your presentation on relating infants' neural tracking of multimodal speech to language development. Thank you for coming to the language circle. It's the first one this year, and I'm really happy to have you. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Lars, and thanks a lot for inviting me here. It's very nice to be here, especially the day before Katharina's defense. So very nice to be here. Okay, yes, so I'm very much interested in how language development occurs in the brain, right? So we have the developing brain. The brain is developing in concert with all the input it gets. It's developing based on the input that it gets. You will learn a language based on the input that you actually get. And so language is developing based on the input, but at the same time, the brain is developing, and I'm very much interested in how these different things interact. What is it about the brain that actually makes language processing possible? And then one important thing that I'm mostly interested in of the brain functioning is the fact that it's rhythmical and what that means for language acquisition. So we know that the brain is a rhythmical system. I don't have to tell you this, so skip over this. We know that a lot of neuronal groups in the brain are firing in synchrony to actually, which might facilitate neuronal communication between different neuronal groups in the brain. But also, and the brain is using different frequencies for communication. But also when there is speech, then the brain also takes over the rhythm of speech. So of course, in speech, there's a lot of different rhythms. There's fast rhythms, which are at faster frequencies like sounds. syllables are slightly slower, and then words or phrases which are also slightly slower. And then all these different sorts of rhythms are followed by the brain. And there has been a lot of research about this, especially in adults, showing that it might be relevant for, so this neural tracking of speech might be important for making temporal predictions about the input, and also for segmenting the incoming speech signal. So you have the continuous speech code that needs to be transformed into a discrete code. And neural tracking might help to do so for all those different frequencies. So what are we talking about when we're talking about rhythm of speech? The most prominent peaks that you have in the speech amplitudes waveforms for adult-directed speech are based on the syllable rate. So there, there's for a lot of different languages, the peaks in the modulation spectrum are seen at around 4 hertz, 4 to 5 hertz, which is the syllable rate. And it doesn't matter whether it's audiobooks or sentences or interviews or conversations, it all has this peak around 45 hertz. While speech is actually, so that's for speech, but music is actually a bit lower, so that's around 2 hertz. And also in infant-directed speech, then also the modulations are slightly slower, so then it's also around 2 hertz. And Goswami has proposed, Usha Goswami, for example, that there is this hierarchical, this hierarchy in infant-directed speech where you have stressed syllables at slower frequencies that are, and then embedded within are syllables and onset and rhymes. So this is from Katarina's very nice thesis. So one idea might be that you have the ongoing oscillations that are then at some point synchronized. So you have ongoing oscillations at different frequencies. So for example, at the stress rate and at the syllable rate, that are then at some point synchronized because of the speech. So that's one idea. But of course, so I really like this figure from Katarina's dissertation as well. So that you have this, because of the speech onset, you have entrainment going on when so the or already occurring endogenous oscillations are being entrained into the speech rhythm. But another explanation might be, or interpretation might be, that you actually have a lot of evoked responses that are occurring because of the speech, and that result in something that looks like an oscillation. And I actually don't want to really go into this debate right now. I'll just call it neural tracking of speech to stay sort of neutral about the underlying mechanisms that might be going on, although I do want to speculate about this at some point. Okay, so here I want to talk about research on neural tracking of speech in infants, and specifically about 2 studies that relate neural speech tracking to word segmentation, and then also address studies relating speech tracking to vocabulary development, so going into individual differences that might be happening there. Then I would like to discuss 2 studies on how visual input might influence neural tracking, and discuss some open questions that are there. So basically what we've seen the last years is that there is neural tracking of speech in infants, right? Infants do show the rhythm of speech if you measure EEG, their EEG. It's already shown in new words for some frequencies, and it's a very strong response, also already in infants. So for example, this is a study by Melis Cicincelik, using speech-brain coherence. So you can look at neural tracking of speech in different ways, but I've mainly used speech-brain coherence, which is basically the consistency of the phase difference between the speech amplitude envelope and the EEG signal at different frequencies, for given frequencies. Normally you then compare the observed speech-brain coherence to sort of random speech-brain coherence where the EEG has been randomly coupled with the speech signal. So there should be no real coupling. So that would be sort of the baseline that you compare it with here. And you see that there is a strong speech-brain coherence across all the electrodes in the brain, basically also at a lot of different frequencies. So it's not limited to like stress rate or syllable rate frequency, especially if you have sort of non-isochronous speech that is consisting of a lot of different frequencies, even though there is the syllable rate or the stress rate that might be prominent, there is still speech-brain coherence at all these different frequencies. So also we see larger tracking of infant-directed speech. So you will know this study from Catarina. Again, she shows a very strong infant speech-brain coherence at the stress rate and the syllable rate. That is, and the stress rate speech-brain coherence is larger for infant-directed speech than for adult-directed speech. And this might be because the amplitude modulations that are occurring within the infant-directed speech are larger. It might also be because there's more attention. That's an open question that I think is still not answered. Okay, so then in my Veni work a couple of years back, I looked at the relation between neural tracking of infants and word segmentation. So of course, for infants, it's a very important early language challenge that they have to segment a continuous speech stream and learn where the word boundaries are. And we know that this is a very important ability. So word segmentation actually predicts language ability as toddlers and preschoolers. And we also know that infants use multiple cues like statistical regularities, but also prosody to segment words from continuous speech. So one important early cue that infants use is again rhythm. And we know that infants are very sensitive to rhythm. So already newborns distinguish different languages based on rhythm. And for example, 7 to 8 month old infants use rhythmic cues to segment speech. So I wanted to assess neural tracking as sort of an underlying mechanism for this. So can we relate neural tracking to word segmentation in infants? So what I did here is measure 108 infants in a longitudinal study. So at 7.5 months, infants, at 7.5 months, I measured their sensitivity to neural rhythm, both using simple beeps. So those were regular and irregular beeps. And child-friendly speech, I would say it was you might call it nursery rhymes, but it was actually book-read child-friendly speech. And then at 9 months, they came back for a head-turn word segmentation task. So I'll just show you some of the stimuli so you have a sort of an idea. So they were listening to very, very boring beeps, which were just beep trains of alternating tones. And then sometimes a tone was missing, so I could also look at the omitted beep and so on, but I'll not go into that. And then we also had the irregular beep trains where the interstimulus interval was irregular. So you get the idea, right? And so there, when you look at the actual power spectrum of the stimuli, I must remember not to use the pointer because then I can actually point to it with the, so you can actually see where I point to on Zoom. So what you see is that actually on the regular beep trains, you see this large peak at 2.5 hertz and also at its harmonic at 5 hertz. But because there is the 400 millisecond interstimulus interval, you have this peak at 2.5 hertz for the regular beep trains, but not for the irregular beep trains. And then here I very simply looked at, so it's called entrainment, but it's just a frequency. I mean, it doesn't need to be entrainment. It's just a frequency response to 2.5 hertz. So just a Fourier transform for 2.5 hertz. And when you look at the power spectrum there, so sorry, again, the mouse, you see that there is this peak in the power spectrum at 2.5 hertz over bilateral electrodes. So infants do show this frequency following response. Then for the speech-brain coherence, infants listen to 90 stories. How are they called in German? 90? Is it so maybe? Yeah. So that you listen to them.
Op een dag kreeg Nijn een brief van haar vriendin. Of Nijn bij haar logeren kwam. Nou, Nijntje had wel zin. Het was de allereerste keer dat Nijn alleen zou gaan. Haar moeder bracht haar naar de bus. Daar kwam de bus al aan.
How much you can follow.
Toen zij een tijd gereden had, keek Nijntje uit het raam. Ze zag...
Yeah. Okay, so and within these specific stimuli, we just assessed where the syllables were occurring and so on. And so the stress syllable rate was a bit below 2 hertz. The word rate was around 3 to 4 hertz, and syllable rate 3 to 5 hertz in this stimuli. And so I actually assessed speech brain coherence from 1 to 7 hertz to get all stress rate, word rate, syllable rate. And again, I find this great large response for speech brain coherence being larger in the observed data than in the random data, basically all across the brain and for all frequencies from 1 to 7 hertz. So then at 9 months, all the infants did a word segmentation head turn study. So here they were familiarized with passages with a reoccurring bisyllabic pseudo word, and then tested for looking times on word lists, which could be either with a familiar word or with novel words. And there we made use of a study that was already done previously by Caroline Junge. So we used the same stimulus materials, and they found a familiarity effect. So we were expecting that as well. And then we wanted to relate the familiarity effect to the frequency response to the beeps and the neural tracking of speech. So first of all, what happens when we relate the entrainment to the simple beep, so at 2.5 hertz, to the familiarity effect at 9 months? And basically, I just looked with cluster randomization across all the electrodes on the scalp to see whether there was a relationship there, and there wasn't. So these simple beeps, the entrainment to it or the frequency response to it is not related to the familiarity effect. And what about the speech-brain coherence? So here I also looked at all frequencies from 1 to 7 hertz and all electrodes in one test. And then there was a specific, there was a difference, and you can't make too much claims about where the effect was specifically, but the cluster that was found was at the frequency of stress syllables. And it was actually a negative relation between the familiarity effect and the speech-brain coherence. And that was not what I predicted, so I was a bit confused what is happening here. So let's look at the underlying data. So here you have all the data for all the different subjects. This is the familiarity effect, standardized familiarity effect, and this is the standardized speech-brain coherence. So above 0 means that the real speech-brain coherence is larger than the random speech-brain coherence. And so up here above 0 means that there is a familiarity effect in the word segmentation task, and below 0, if it's far enough below 0, I must say, it means that there is a novelty effect in the word segmentation task. So apparently, those infants that show a novelty effect are actually showing the largest speech-brain coherence for this frequency. So to just explore how this happens, I just took all the infants showing a novelty effect and took all the infants showing a familiarity effect. And so to realize that I started out with more than 100 subjects, but now I need data, subjects who have good data both in the EEG and in the word segmentation task, right? So this results in less infants, sadly. But those infants that showed a familiarity effect didn't show any speech-brain coherence at this frequency, while the infants that showed a novelty effect had this left lateralized speech-brain coherence at the stress syllable rate. So frequency response to simple beeps was not related, but the speech-brain coherence to stress syllables was, yeah.
Just from my understanding, so novelty effect means they looked more frequently to the unknown.
Yes, to the novel words.
Okay,
yeah. Yeah, and so that is, of course, that is often a problem with those sort of head turn tests, right? That sometimes you get a familiarity effect, sometimes you get a novelty effect. They both mean that there has been identified a difference, but It might also be just variation around 0, but it appears to be somewhat meaningful here, right? So here, you might say this is perhaps saying there's some functional relevance of neural tracking of speech, and it's related to tracking of the speech rhythm at the stress syllable rate. But then what does it mean with the novelty response, right? So one interpretation might be that the novelty responder shows sort of a more mature response, because if you have this Hunter and Ames model, first infants will show no response, and at some point they will show a familiarity response. And if they're getting bored, or if they just know it already, they will show a novelty response. So this might be influenced both by familiarization time or by maturation. We don't know. So it might be that novelty responders should show a more mature response. So there's a difference in tempo that we're assessing here. It also might be that they're just doing something different, right? So that they're using a different mechanism, either for this experiment or in general, we don't know. Yeah, so I think these are interesting results suggesting some relationship between word segmentation and neural tracking of speech, but exactly how the mechanisms are underlying that is something to be explored in the future. So one other study that I did together with Fleur Vissers and Anne Keusum is again looking at neural tracking of speech and word segmentation, but now within one EEG experiment. And there we were specifically interested in how rhythmicity influenced word segmentation, and how that then relates, how neural tracking then related to word segmentation in those different rhythmical conditions. So what we did here, we tested 65 10-month-olds using rhythmic and non-rhythmic speech. And there they listened within one session, they listened to 20 blocks of familiarization and test, where in the familiarization, they heard sentences with one particular word occurring in each and every sentence. And then in the test phase, they listened to single words. And within the speech familiarization phase, we could then look at the speech-brain coherence. And within the test phase, I looked at the word familiarity, ERP, that would suggest if there's a difference between the familiar and the novel words, that there is segmentation of the word in the previous sentences. So we infants took part in 2 sessions, one rhythmic and one non-rhythmic. So we made sort of a strange manipulation of rhythmicity here. So it was turning to be quite, of course, we use natural language, but we turn it into something a bit unnatural because of the way we recorded this. So what we did here is you can perhaps see already that the sentences are quite long for those sort of experiments. But also what we did is we had alternating strong and weak syllables all the time. So this will be buien in de winter maken alle gondels nat, right? So you have strong, weak, strong, weak, strong, weak all the time. So they were always the same, like 13 syllables, and always this alternation between the syllables. I can show you the experiment. We actually recorded it with a metronome. So it was actually quite boring, I think, die stimuli.
Buien in de winter maken alle gondels nat. Aan die rode gondels hangen nergens lampions. Net als echte Spaanse gondels zijn de Duitse buien in de buien.
So you can hear that is sort of having this metronome recording while sort of the natural prosody is lost, right? So that's what the rhythmic stimuli look like. And then for the non-rhythmic stimuli, what we did is for 2 syllables, we would either slow them down or speed them up. And only the target would stay the same. And that would result in something very strange, which you can listen to here.
Buien in de winter maken alle gondels nat. Aan die rode gondels hangen nergens lampions. Net als echte Spaanse gondels zijn de Duitse mooi.
Yeah, so you can hear that. How is that for non-native speakers? Because of course I heard. Is the first one the rhythmical one? Is that like is it very boring? No, somewhat. I see some nods and some.
Well, pleasingly boring.
Yeah. And then this second one is just quite strange, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so when you look at the stimuli, the power spectrum within the stimuli of the non-rhythmic here in red and the rhythmic is here in blue, then you see that both the syllable frequency and the stressed syllable frequency are very prominent in this metronome recorded rhythmic speech. So for the speech-brain coherence, we look specifically at the syllable rate, which was at 3.2 hertz, then for the stimuli, and the stress syllable rate, which was at 1.6 hertz. And then based on previous literature, we identified specific left frontal ERP effects we wanted to look at in the test phase. And so we had 27 infants with good data in both sessions. So what was happening in the familiarization phase? So there we're looking at speech-brain coherence. And you see basically speech-brain coherence again, both in the rhythmic and the non-rhythmic condition. But for the syllable rate, it was larger in the rhythmic than the non-rhythmic condition. And for the stress syllable rate, there was also speech-brain coherence in both conditions. And again, somewhat larger in the rhythmic than the non-rhythmic condition, which was what we expected, actually. So then what about the ERP word familiarity effect? If we look at the complete group overall in the rhythmic condition and the non-rhythmic condition, basically we see no significant word familiarity effect and also no interaction between familiarity and rhythmicity. And it's good to realize that these are quite long and boring sentences, so it's sort of something that might indeed be challenging for infants. So what about individual differences? Can we somehow see relationship with speech-brain coherence? So what we did here is just quite artificially divide the group.
Oh, that had the question, I think.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry to stop you in your sequence. Just a clarification. When you did the speech-brain coherence on the rhythmic, non-rhythmic, how long the story was, how long the piece of your of the analysis in terms of time? Was it one sentence at a time or entire story?
Yeah, so there is, of course, the complete story, which I'm not completely sure how long that the complete story would take, but we cut the complete story in trials of 5 seconds. So we have a 0.2 hertz resolution to be able to look at a 3.2 hertz and 1.6 hertz.
I see, and the EEG was recorded for the entire story.
Yes, it was just
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so no overall effect, but what we then did is split the group into half. Those infants showing the largest speech-brain coherence and those infants showing the smallest speech-brain coherence for the syllable rate. And what we then get is a rhythmicity times familiarity times coherent group interaction in the following way. So this is the low coherence group. So those are the infants showing the smallest coherence. In the rhythmic condition, they do show this standard negative word familiarity effect where there is where the unfamiliar words are, the familiar words are more negative than the unfamiliar words, which is often seen in infants, while in adults you see a positive repetition effects, right? And also sometimes in infants you see positive repetition effects, and that might then be related either to them not having a mature enough response, or it might also be that like what we see in adults, that it's more sort of a repetition suppression effect instead of like a learning effect that you would identify the negative word familiarity as. So this would be sort of the standard negative word familiarity effect in the rhythmic condition. In the non-rhythmic condition, if anything, they show a positive effect, but it's actually not significant. Then for the high coherence group, so those are the infants that synchronize highly to syllables. in the rhythmic condition, they actually show a positive word familiarity effect. So then you could go two ways in speculating, right? It might either be that the high coherence infants are less mature and show this positive effect, or it might be that they're bored and they show the positive effect. It can be two ways and we don't know. And in this strange non-rhythmical condition, again, I mean, you might say they're perhaps starting to get a negative familiarity effect, but it's again, it's just non-significant, so you can't say anything about it. So that's if we divide groups based on a syllable rate, we could of course also divide, and if, I realize this is all extremely exploratory, right? So everything take it with a grain of salt. But if you then divide groups based on stressed syllable rate, what happens? And actually nothing happens. So there's no relation between stressed syllable rates, synchrony, and the word familiarity, ERP. So here, speech-brain coherence at the syllable rate seems to be related to the ERP word familiarity effect, again indicating a relationship between neural tracking of speech and word segmentation. And of course, it's at this point still quite unclear what these individual differences might mean, right? So they could be interactions between neural possibilities of infants, linguistics abilities, attention to specific stimulus materials, requirements of the stimulus materials. Of course, both experiments had completely different stimulus material, the one with the engaging 90 story, the other with the sort of boring, more artificial rhythmic and non-rhythmic stimuli that might also require different things. So how these things interact is still something to assess in the future. And just this is another study that I would like to show also to get, because there also we manipulated rhythmicity, but then we found something different. So to again, take into account the different stimulus materials that you might have that might also influence the attention and the tracking of the child. So this is a study from the PhD work of Laura Haan, where she tested again 10-month-old children. And there she manipulated speech for rhyme and rhythm. So I'll not discuss the rhyme part, but go into the metered part here. So again, we had strong, weak syllables that were alternating. So for the metered non-rhyme and metered rhyme, we had against weak, strong, weak, strong. In this case, it was a bit shorter stimuli. And it was, although it was recorded with a metronome, it did contain more of the original, of the prosody, of the like background prosody. So I'll show how this, I'll let you hear the stimuli.
Giraffen eten verse vip. Ze knagen telkens groene sos. Behoorlijk kaal is dus die lijg. Na 1 bezoek van 15 vaaf.
And for those of you knowing a bit of Dutch, the final word is a pseudo word, so it's good if you don't know it. That was because because it was easier to manipulate the rhyme then, and we thought the children wouldn't care anyway. I'll let you hear the rhyming one as well to just get a better idea of the stimuli.
Giraffen eten verse bijp. Ze knagen telkens groene fijp. Behoorlijk kaal is dus die dijp. Na 1 bezoek van 15 kijp.
Then we of course had a lot of different of those stories, right? And then for the non-metered conditions, what we did was in each and every sentence either add 1 syllable or take 1 syllable out. And then so this sort of strong, weak rhythm would be gone from it, but we still had the underlying prosody, which might actually be even more pronounced in this case.
Giraffen eten graag verse vip. Ze knagen ook telkens groene sos. Behoorlijk kaal is dus nu die lijg. Na 2 bezoeken van 15 vaaf.
So sort of this very rhythmical thing is gone, but it still has sort of the natural prosody. And when you look at the power spectra of the stimuli, what you see is that actually the syllable rate is there for both, for all conditions, but the stress rate is more pronounced in the metered than in the non-metered condition. And there what we see is for the stress rates, so again, there's speech-brain coherence for all conditions, but when we compare this meter, so the more rhythmical condition, to the non-meter, so the less rhythmical condition, there's no difference in speech-brain coherence at the stress rate. Well, that was the rate that you actually did see differences in this power spectra. Well, for the syllable rate, so at the metered condition, you see this bilateral response. For the rhythmic condition. For the non-rhythmic condition, it seems to be larger overall, and there is actually a mid-frontal effect here that's showing a difference for the non-metered and the metered condition in terms of speech-brain coherence. So, and this was actually more speech-brain coherence for the non-rhythmical condition, which was, of course, contrary to the other study and also contrary to what we expected. But actually, when we listened to those stimuli again, we thought the non-metered might have been more attention grabbing or actually nicer to listen to. And it might, and this is pure speculation, but the fact that this is mid-frontal, where you also see this mid-frontal theta response, that you see if children are engaged and are actively learning and stuff, it might be that there's some interaction going on there between this frontal midline theta response and the speech-brain coherence, but that's also something that I would really like to disentangle in future studies.
How old are these again?
10 months. Yeah. And you often see quite strong responses at 10 months actually in the frontal midline response. So, but this just to show how like a different stimuli will have a huge impact on what you will see in terms of results and how which way the results will go. Okay, so Laura also related the syllable rate speech-brain coherence, and this might then actually be a combination of both, like perhaps the simple speech entrainment or speech neural tracking, and perhaps some effect of this from frontal midline theta. I'm not really sure, but in any case, the syllable rate tracking was then related to later vocabulary at 18 months. And this goes well, this is something that has been found more often. The first one to report it was Katarina in the study she did as a master thesis, where she looked at infants at risk for autism and infants with no risk for autism. But because of that, we had quite a huge range of vocabulary, which also, it was a relatively small group. So here in 10 months old, there was this relation between coherence at the stress syllable rate, while there was no such correlation for 14-month-old infants. And this is something we're going to replicate actually, or we're going to try to replicate in a very large cohort of the youth cohort in Utrecht, where they tested thousands of infants using the same stimuli that Katarina used in this study. So it would be very nice to see whether this effect actually holds up in a larger sample. So that was for some nursery rhymes, where there was a relation between the stress syllable rate and the vocabulary. So Laura, as I said, found a relation between the syllable, speech-brain coherence, and vocabulary at 18 months in those rhythmical speech stimuli. Also, my PhD student, Melis Tejancelik, has found in 2 different studies, again, relations between both syllable speech-brain coherence and later vocabulary, but also in one study for stress syllable speech-brain coherence. And again, it might be that it's just a group, or it's just the specific stimuli that ask for a specific frequency to be important. It also might be that it's just in general the low frequency, because in those studies, the syllable frequencies was always quite slow, so below 4 Hertz even. So for example, also Adam Atahiri and colleagues found a relation between those very slow neural tracking and later vocabulary. So it might be some general response that's not specific to either stress syllables or syllable rates, but that's an open question at this point. So how are we doing in terms of time?
We're doing fine.
Good. Then I would like to tell a bit more about those studies from Melis and Celik looking at audiovisual speech. So until now, I've spoken mostly about the tracking to speech stimuli, but of course, we're living in a multimodal world, right? Caregivers use ostensive cues in communication, so that they use both infant-directed speech to show that they're directing an infant, but also eye gaze. And we already know that infant-directed speech is more enhanced in, so that speech-brain coherence is more enhanced in infant-directed speech, but that's also eye gaze that modulates speech-brain coherence. Because we know eye gaze facilitates information transfer and enhances attention. We also know that the eye gaze of the partner, so whether you're making eye contact and gaze following, is important for things like object processing and word objects mapping that infants are learning. But is it actually also related to speech processing and word segmentation? That's an open issue. So what Melis did was, again, test 10-month-old infants. And they, again, listened to blocks of speech with sentences where words were repeated, and then a test phase with single words. So we also looked at word segmentation there. I will not go into that results. You can look at the paper there. She did find some effects on word segmentation based on gaze. But now we're talking about speech-brain coherence. So here, what we did was record both from the front and from the side. So we have exactly the same stimuli across infants that were listened to, but either with direct gaze or with averted gaze. So I'll let you listen again to stimuli so you have an idea, and also to realize that this is very clear and very slow also infant-directed speech.
Er zitten cello's in het orkest. Goede cello's zijn van hout gemaakt. Ik hoorde vanochtend cello's. Met de pauken spelen vaak de cello's mee.
It's a different example, obviously, than the one in context, but you get the idea, right? So here, so we looked at the speech-brain coherence again in the familiarization phase, and there what we saw was that speech-brain coherence was not affected by eye gaze. So there was speech-brain coherence both in the averted gaze and in the directed gaze condition, and there was no difference between them. But again, the tracking of the syllable rate, which was in the study around 3 Hertz, positively predicted 18-month vocabulary. And in a second study, Melis looked at the effect of mouth cues. So we know that infants are very interested also in what's happening at the mouth. So the attention, so first they really like looking at eyes, but at some point that moves to the mouth. So between 6 to 12 months, here you see there's more and more attention to the mouth, which then later on returns to the eyes again. So around 10 months, they're very interested in mouth movements. And also whether infants are interested in those mouth movements is also linked to vocabulary development. So something might be happening here. And one idea is that if you follow the visual movements of the mouth, so there, of course, your mouth is opening and closing in the same rhythm as the syllables, and this might help in following the speech rhythm. And so the visual rhythm is slightly preceding the auditory rhythm and might actually help to follow this rhythm. And so there is actually this strong temporal correspondence between speech and the articulatory movements, especially at the syllable rate. So the question is now whether this then also facilitates neuron tracking of speech in infants. So here we used the same stimuli actually, but now there we put this block in front of the mouth cues. So we debated a lot about whether we wanted to use something like a mask really, or to just block out. So in the end, we took this one. So you still see, because she's moving, you see sort of part of her face. And of course, you still see the eyebrows, which might also give links about the rhythm of the speech, but not so much the syllable rhythm, perhaps. I'll just let you see the stimuli.
Er zitten cello's in het orkest. Goede cello's zijn van hout gemaakt. Ik hoorde vanochtend cello's. Met de pauken spelen vaak de cello's mee.
So you still see all the eyebrow twist, but not the mouth and the jaw movements and so on.
Er zitten cello's in het orkest.
So again, we find strong speech-brain coherence, which is related to language development, but there's again no effect of being able to see those visual articulatory movements on the speech-brain coherence. So you don't need it, basically, which we also already knew because we also saw speech-brain coherence for speech-only stimuli. But it's not, if the speech is clear, like here, you don't need it and it's not going to make a difference. It might be different in noisy situations, right? When there's multiple speakers or when there's something else where a noisy condition. And then we all know that if we're in a noisy room, we will start to look at people more because then we can actually, then the visual movements might actually help, right? So it might be how that is then affecting speech-brain coherence in infants, and whether it's in fact affecting that at all, that's an open issue, because we also know that this auditory visual integration is actually developing well into childhood. So it takes quite a while before children are real experts in auditory visual integration. So that's something that I also would like to explore in further studies. Yeah, I said this already. Okay, so infants do show this clear neural tracking of speech, especially for infant-directed speech. It seems to be related to word segmentation abilities. It might be it is modulated by rhythm. We saw 2 studies that modulated it in opposite ways. So there might also be this effect of attention to the stimuli that is also affected by the rhythm in this case. Also, infants' neural tracking of speech is related to later vocabulary development. And in clear infant-directed speech, visual cues do not modulate neural tracking. So I'm somewhat in the synchronizers camp, right? So I would say that neural oscillations in the infant brain synchronize with the rhythm of speech, tracking it at different frequencies. And this process is related to word segmentation and later language abilities. But how exactly that works out is an open issue. And my hypothesis is that actually this rhythmic neural tracking of speech reflects infants' attention to specific parts of the speech signal. So if they are attending stressed syllables, then you will see larger stressed syllable tracking. This might be something that is influenced, that is because this infant likes to track at that particular frequency. It also might be because they have just learned to segment bisyllabic words and they are now listening to those sort of patterns in speech. It might be because there's some completely different reason, right? That is because the stimulus asks for it or not. So it reflects the attention, which might be somewhat not all too satisfying. But at the same time, it might also act as a core mechanism for maximizing the temporal attention to those parts that are interesting. So if you're attending the stressed syllable rate and you need to segment bisyllabic words from the speech stream, then that will actually help you to maximize your attention to those words. And this then puts a constraint on neural processing that maximizes the uptake of relevant information from this noisy multimodal environment. So questions that I would like to explore. So you might notice nice figure from Tineke M. So we know that, of course, there is development in the electrophysiology. So this is another picture showing it in a slightly different way. So from 1 to 18 months, there is a large increase in especially the higher frequencies. And we have this development here also in the lower frequencies. So that is all happening in these first years. And how does that then constrain processing, or how does that make processing possible? That's something that I think will be very nice to explore. And we've seen these individual differences in neural tracking relating to word segmentation and language development, but how do those happen, and how do then neural possibilities or constraints in development interact with the developing linguistic abilities, but also the requirements of the stimulus materials. So the different stimulus might ask for a different processing and a different environment. So a multimodal environment, a noisy environment with multiple speakers will also ask for different processing. So I think these are interesting open questions. And then for all these individual differences, it's of course also a problem, like similar to what we saw with the familiarity and novelty effect in the head turn studies, with the positive and negative word familiarity effect in the ERP studies. Here also you can have like more neural tracking if there's more attention, but also if infants are showing more effort, or if there's more proficiency. So we know that from adult studies as well, right? That tracking of speech is related both to attention, but also to effort, proficiency, which can all result in different directions of effects. So I think that is something that would be very nice to try to disentangle also for infants. Yeah, and that's something that I hope to do also in the next years with the VD grant from Emil. Thank you, and thanks a lot for a lot of different people who helped out with this study. Of course, the PhD students Laura and Pelis, but also the rest, and also Iris, because she tested a lot of things. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tineke, for an inspiring presentation. I think we start with questions from the Zoom audience. So if you have a question, then please type some kind of summary version of it into the chat, and then we can go through the questions one by one.
Or just raise your hand.
Yeah, or just raise your hand.
I can't see the chat.
Claudia said that she had to leave earlier and is excited to see you tomorrow.
Okay. Odette has a question.
Take the time.
As usual, I'm a troublemaker.
I warned her beforehand.
I thought maybe, Lars, you will block my accent. No, I'm joking.
I would do that.
Well, I have 2 points that I wanted to raise. One relates to, you know, the former question that I asked, the part of your talk that you tracked EEGs and stimulus brain coherence on large stories. I wonder if I didn't understand, did you at the same time track behavior?
No. So we are, so for the audiovisual experiment, we did code whether they were looking at the screen or not, and only included trials where they were looking at the screen.
So for that particular part, so the question that I have is, who knows if the rhythms that you measured, you know, the different oscillations are at all related to behavior? That's question number one. And question number two relates to your attention, you know, hypothesis, which is extremely important, I think. And I'm surprised that you didn't mention Patricia Kuhl's contribution to that, especially in the audiovisual dimension, where she showed that if an infant looks at a high definition screen and interacts through the screen, it doesn't have any, it has very minor attention effect compared to interaction in person. So the question is the technique of using slides or images on the screen as an input has, has limited effect in our understanding.
Absolutely. So it would, of course, be, so here, I think it's also nice that we can actually just track the EEG activity without the infants, without asking the infants to show any behavior, right? So we're just recording what is happening in their brain while they're listening to the stimuli. And I completely realized that at the same time, they might be doing a lot of different things, right? So they're, especially with this speech stimuli, they're in this EEG cabin, they're listening to the speech stimuli, but at the same time, they're on their parents' lap, they are often looking at some screensaver, there might be looking at blowing bubbles, right? So there's a lot of things happening, and whether they're actually paying attention to the auditory stimuli or not is, we don't know, right? But still there is this auditory processing going on, and things like the beats that you see, the rhythm of the stimuli reflected in the EEG activity suggest that they are responding to this. So of course, whether it's related to behaviors, so I try to relate it to later behavior with the word segmentation task and with the vocabulary development. And I must confess, I wouldn't know how to actually do that on the spot with 10-month-old infants. And I think it's so nice that with EEG, you can just measure without asking the infants to do any behavior. And on the second part, whether it's, of course, a screen interaction or a live interaction, that will indeed make a huge difference. And it would be very interesting to also look at live interactions. I know, Katarina, you also did the...
We actually found no difference at all.
Yeah, so there you have the live interaction, and also you assessed whether they were looking at the mother or not, and that this didn't make a difference for the eye gaze either. But I would completely agree that if there would be an effect, then you would find it more, you would be more likely to find it in a live interaction setting. Yeah.
Just before I go, I want to commend you and understand how difficult your task is. So my questions, are, I'm sorry, but, I just wanted to make sure that you understand that I fully appreciate the difficulty that you have in your research.
I completely agree with you, but we have to deal with what we have. Yeah.
Okay, Professor Vulkanova is, I think, the next one to ask a question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for a lovely talk. I really enjoyed listening, and especially the longitudinal perspective and the associations with language outcomes later. I have a question. So you are providing evidence of tracking at different frequencies. But your stimuli were mostly at this child-directed speech, kind of slower frequency. Do you have evidence of brain to stimulus coherence, for instance, for faster rates, like the typical adult speech, 4.55 Hertz?
Okay, so we also see the speech brain coherence for those somewhat faster frequencies. So for example, this first longitudinal study that I spoke there, we looked at 1 to 7, and basically until 7 we see it. I would think you would even see it higher, but I haven't tested that. There are other people who have looked at higher frequencies, but I haven't.
Okay. Do you think it has to do with rhythmicity or not?
Yeah, I think rhythmicity is extremely important, and it can help with starting to with making this sort of, if you have a very rhythmical signal, it can help you to be in a specific
To entrain or
Then it gives you possibilities for processing at those specific rhythmical points in time. But at the same time, of course, speech is often is often also non-isochronous, right? So it's changing somewhat in rhythm. Although you might have this somewhat stable underlying syllable rhythm, it's still changing, and we have to deal with that. And I think what is very important for infants also to learn is that they have to adapt to this rhythm all the time. And in the end, I think what will influence mostly how proficient infants can be in speech processing is that they have to deal with this flexibility of rhythm, and they have to quickly adapt their tracking.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Questions from the room?
Thank you for your great talk. So now here you show the speech tracking of, like, for example, stress level. So I wonder about your view about, like, what about this children with different languages, such as Mandarin, we have like just monosyllable or non-stress. What's with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So whether your language requires you to track at a specific rhythm will also influence how important that will be, or whether you need to develop that at all, right? So the fact that we here see tracking of stress rhythm, syllable rhythms being related to word segmentation in those Dutch infants, for Dutch infants, it's important to track those stressed syllables because they often occur at the start of words. You often have a stressed syllable, and also especially in these materials, because we used often those trochaic words, then it's really important to track. But if you have a language where it's not that important, then you might, and there's different requirements, and you might see different frequencies being important there. But in any case, there's also syllables across all the different languages, I think. And you have this rhythmical system in the brain that is being used to process. So I think, so my hunch would be that in most languages, you would need sort of this rhythmical processing, but how exactly that turns out to be and what rhythms are important for your language to attend to might differ per language.
I have a related question, and you partially already answered it with this. So it's about the study where you use the stressed and strong and weak patterns. And I was wondering if your target word had always the same strong weak pattern, with the strong being the first that is more familiar also in Dutch, as we just said.
Yeah, so the target words we used for these word segmentation were always bisyllabic words with stress on the first syllable. Yeah.
So can you speculate? Like what you think would happen if you would revert that pattern for your target words?
So we know from word segmentation studies, for example, that they are starting, that Dutch and English infants are starting to segment those like iambic words later than trochaic words. And I would think that for segmenting those words, you would need to focus not only on the stressed syllable rhythm, but also definitely on the syllable rhythm, right? So you can't do this for this segmentation. You will be able to segment, when tracking the stressed syllable rate, you will be able to segment those trochaic words, but perhaps not the iambic words. So there, the syllable frequency might then be more important, right? But that it's definitely an open issue.
That's actually, I just want to follow up on that. I wanted to suggest that, you could fully cross the two things, right? I was also thinking when you showed the group split, you could reanalyze the phase relationships or the exact angle at which the two groups synchronize. It's probably unlikely because these are already 10 months old, right? So they have heard their share of Dutch. But it could be that you have like a phase opposition between the groups, such that some children think they should try iambic and some should try trochaic to like do the task. I know.
So you mean sort of time lock to the second syllable or something,
and see what the exact phase is.
Yeah.
That's just speculation, but sorry, I didn't want to take away the question from someone else.
Yeah, but also I think one just interesting thing to point out also is here we're looking at, this is the ERP to the single words, right? So if you're looking at ERPs to continuous speech, it's just sort of you don't see like those sort of peaks that you do see for those single words. But here you might see actually there's much like a stronger peak here for the high coherence. So perhaps showing more phase reset or something, or phase some effect that's showing this stronger peak, which I have in no way analyzed. It's just visual speculation, based on visual on the visual thing. But those infants in the high coherence group do show this strong peak here, that is not much less strong in the low coherence group. So there might be something. So I think it would also be interesting to look at again the underlying neurophysiology here to see whether there is something about that perhaps those infants are better already in phase resetting based on stimuli. That's one possibility, right? And that is also the trouble then, if you're then using a measure of word segmentation that's relying on this, like then it sort of gets circular, right?
So exactly to cross it.
Yeah. And that was also why in this other study I wanted to test this word segmentation in not with EEG but with behavior. But then of course the head-turn study has head-turn paradigm has its own difficulties also with this novelty and familiarity response, right?
I have more questions, if I may. The phase opposition I already asked. One question I had was about your frontal midline theta effect, which you call theta. And I know that just as the high frequencies come in ontogenetically, there's literature suggesting that the leading frequencies in the cortex, so alpha and theta, they slow down during development, right? Is that the idea? No, I think alpha speeds up.
Speeds up, yeah.
Yeah, alpha speeds up and theta also speeds up?
Yes.
There's this childhood theta and childhood alpha. So what I want to say is whether that's really could also be an attention.
Those are different. Like if you have the problem also, if you're looking at infant theta, and it's like the frontal theta response, that's actually at the same frequency that you have the dominant response, that is the alpha response, right? So those are sort of intermingled.
Exactly.
So we could try to disentangle those with ICA or something, but yeah.
Yeah, or just like it would be interesting in terms of function, right? So this is kind of, you're trying to, also address attention and how it relates to probably the peaks and troughs and kind of slower rate responses. So probably I know that there's work on phasic modulations of alpha in adults, and it could be similar in this group if this is actually a modulation of attention. Just, or like you say, just dissociate them with an ICA, but that's chronically hard because the frequencies will be so similar. Yeah, and that's already hard in adults, like dissociating the different alpha rhythms. Occasionally, they are just a couple of point hertz apart, so it's tough to do that computationally. Final question. No, two more. The one was for the group split as well, and of course, I've been dating a language acquisition researcher for a while, but this positivity negativity thing, did you acquire hormone levels from these kids? No, right? Because I know that that's one of the factors that's being discussed in the literature.
Yeah, cool. That's really cool.
For learning and non-learning, right? And the boys are bad because they have too much testosterone, and so they can't learn properly.
Check at least with the boys and girls what the difference is there, but hormone levels I don't have.
And final question, what do we know? And I know nothing, I'm sure you know something about it. People looking at each other. I'm a person who never looks at people during talking for whatever reason. And I was wondering, what's the longitudinal data on mothers and children looking at each other? Do children really look at their mothers when the mother speaks, or do children look somewhere else? the mother always tries to look at the child. I just don't know.
Well, children do look at their parents, I think. I mean, but when they're speaking, but not at some point when they're playing, like when you have all those joint attention sessions, then they're attending their toy, and like their parent is looking at what they're looking at, right? But it's not, then it's definitely not the case that they're all the time looking at their parent.
Yes.
But of course, in this very early days where you have the parent, where they don't crawl yet, and they just have the parent hanging above their crib, talking to them, then they're definitely very much interested in eyes and at some point also mouth. So
that's what I was hoping for, not hoping for, but the brilliant answer, because I mean this idea that the different senses, of course, can play different roles in different critical phases, basically,
Yes.
right? So maybe at this point, your children are already interested in reference and focusing on target items that they can like assign meaning to listening, just listening to them, right?
yeah, and it's also around this age of like 9 to 10 months then you have this joint attention also being very important, and it's also very important that they look at that they follow the eye gaze and so on, right, for objects, for object mapping. And so then it might not be good to always look at you, right?
Exactly.
And also it might be distracting attention, right? And there also people might differ in how much it distracts attention. So that's also something I want to look at in future studies, to look at people with and without autism, children without autism, who also might differ in how they use those multimodal cues while processing speech. To also assess like differences on in that.
Yes, that would be very interesting. Yeah. Are there more questions online or in the room? Gisela.
Yeah, I have a question also on the group split with the low and high coherence. So now you split up the groups. Do you also find this effect if you don't split up but just look at the effect of coherence? So is there like a either you have it or you don't? Or
yeah, we just did it this way. So yeah.
What would you expect?
It might be that you get it out. It might be that you don't, because I don't know. I really don't know.
So you don't have more. I mean, unrelated to any like.
So I haven't followed this the way that I did with the other one with like all the, whether they're all on sort of a scale. It's an interesting question, right? Whether there is just whether this would be a scale or a group thing.
Yeah.
And this was a decision at some point by a master thesis student to divide the groups, right? So since that things work, and then I don't want to explore like all sorts of different analysis, obviously, but it would be still interesting. Yeah.
I think my question, when I think of it now, is more on a like conceptually. Do you think this is sort of like something that you at a certain point, so they cross a certain threshold and then you do it, or is it just like a slowly acquired process or something like that?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. We don't know the answer, but I think it's also, it might be something that at some point you are able to track at a specific frequency, but you might use it in different settings. You might either use it or not use it, right? So it might be, so it's both the possibility to do it, which might also have to do with this developing electrophysiological constraints, but then also the mood of the infants, whether they're tired or not, whether they've already done a lot that day, specific stimulus materials, are they interesting or not? Are they something that they're interested in at that moment or not, right? So, yeah.
I think if there are no further questions, let's thank our speaker again, Tineke. Thank you for joining. Also the folks online, spread the word. We'll see each other again for the next language circle. And for all the others, see you tonight at the vegan house. Okay. Take care, everyone.